So today is God's Work, Our Hands Sunday, and I had gotten a question about 3 weeks ago from a fellow pastor who said, basically, how in the world do you get your folks to do all these cool things? I can't get my folks to do like one. And I said, well, first of all, I don't get them to do anything. They just all sign up. And he said, well, what did you do to get them to be that way? And I'm like, I don't know. They were that way when I showed up. And he said, well, what do you think? How do you think your community got there? Because I'd love mine to follow. And I sat there and I thought, I've never asked that question. It's just always been who Nativity is. It's who I met in my first interview. It's just part of our DNA, for lack of a better way of saying it. So I've had 3 weeks to think about it, and here's my thought. I'm going to go and be abnormally theological for a moment. So for those of you who like theology, yay! For those of you who don't, just bear with me. I will get out of the rabbit hole, I promise. So we as Lutherans believe in this dichotomy of law and gospel. When we say gospel, what we really mean, everyone's gonna have flashbacks to confirmation class here. What we really mean is that sometimes people fall into despair. People think that they cannot be loved or they're unlovable. And what the gospel message is to remind you that there is no power on earth, no power in hell or heaven, no power in the past, the present, or the future that can separate you from the love of God. Period. End of story. There is never a point where God does not love you. That is the gospel. Something when we are in despair, we desperately wish to hear. However, some of us don't fall into despair on this side, but go the opposite direction. Anyone else remember Saturday Night Live, the church lady? Yeah, all right. If you don't know who the church lady is, please Google it later. It is very worth it. It may not resonate in today's society because most of the church ladies aren't in church anymore. They're currently TikTok influencers telling you how everything in your life is wrong, and they are so much better than you. If you don't know how to do that, then just look up trad wife, and you will get a whole list. Church lady basically is very convinced she is definitely loved by God, but the rest of you? She does not need to be reminded that God loves her. She's got that part down. But she does need to be reminded that she isn't perfect. What the law does is the law is a part of the Bible that challenges us to be better. Because none of us be perfect. And by that, it helps bring humility. Because all of us, we all have things to work on. We always will. It's the human condition. It's who we are. If we don't recognize that about ourselves, we're in a bad church lady place. Now, within the law, and this is where I'm going to have a disclaimer for all those highly theologically educated people, there are 3. I know, some of you just went, no, there's 2. I went 3 uses of the law. And I'll get into why I have my disclaimers, but first let's go with 1 and 2 that are not controversial. First one is civil law. That's what we think about when we say law. It's like the thing lawyers deal with. Why do we have civil law? Well, if civil law is just and it is good, then you should probably follow it because you know what? Anarchy is really not good. As great as it might sound, anarchy is horrible, folks. That's 1. We as Christians, if it's a just law, should follow it. 2, the law, like what's in the Bible that tells you like good and bad and things like that, is a mirror they can hold up to yourself. I do that every Sunday just about, where I say go and pray about this, think about this, wander about this, whatever, right? Go and do this thing. Where you hold up a mirror, and just like after a good haircut, the person turns around and says, do you like how the back looks? Do you like how the front looks, right? We've all had those conversations. The same idea, the Bible does that to us, and sometimes we look and we go, yeah, that's great. And other times we go, whoa. That ain't good. Now, we'll get into that third. Now we're getting into the third use. And for those of you who say it doesn't exist, yes, it does. It's in the Solid Declaration of Faith, section 6. Read that. Okay? The third use of law is this idea that once you see the warts and the problems, you do something about it. You don't just go, huh? You say, okay, I've been overly judgmental. I should work on that. I drink too much. I should work on that. I yell too much. I should work on that. Whatever it is you got to work on, doing it is good because in doing that, you're becoming more of who Christ wants you to be. Okay? Now, disclaimers. There are those who would say that the third use of the law is directly an extension of the second use of the law. Therefore, it's better to say that it is 2.1 or 2a if you were to put a bullet thing. Sure, I don't care how we number things. Now, there will be people who say, I don't like the third use of the law. Okay, fine, that's a debate you theologians can have. But it gets drawn to a weird place. Let me explain what I mean by weird place. You can debate whether or not it was the money used to get to the moon, to do the moon landing back in 60 whatever, right, was either worth it or not, right? Like, that's a debate to have. Some people say, we spent billions of dollars and came back with basalt I could have picked up on the Pacific Ocean floor for a 100th of the cost. Others would say, but we did this amazing scientific breakthrough. That's a debate. I don't care. Debate that. But there's a difference between having the debate of whether or not it is a good thing or a bad thing, a worthwhile thing or not, and the debate that also occurs in that same thing where you have a group of humans who say the moon landing never happened, right? Like, that's different. That's denialism. We all agree the moon landing happened on the moon. It wasn't just like someplace in Canada where they secretly filmed, okay? Unfortunately, our theologians have scooted from arguing mostly whether or not the third use of law is good or bad and moved into this world where they just straight up deny that it exists. Hence, me giving a quote earlier as to where it exactly is. To understand why they got there, we got to understand history a little bit. We're slowly coming out of the rabbit hole, I promise. Just bear with me, folks. After the silent generation, World War II generation of clergy horribly abused that third use of the law. Because what they did with it for 2 generations was to sit up here and tell you you are horrible, awful sinners who are going to burn in the pits of hell, and that God is standing there holding you above it, waiting for an excuse with some scissors to drop you in. And then what they filled in was stuff that wasn't in the Bible. For example, one of the big things back in the day was biblical womanhood. Okay, unfortunately for evangelical non-denominational friends, it's still a thing for them. Unfortunately, what followed was not what women in the Bible did. What followed was a series of Victorian ethics, right? They'd say, to be a good woman, you should not have a job. To be a good woman, to be a good Christian woman, you should raise your kids. Now, if you want to raise your kids and be a stay-at-home mom, there are definitely people in the Bible who did that. However, what they don't tell you is you also had women in the Bible who were pastors. You also had women in the Bible who were generals. You also had a woman in the Bible who went ahead and assassinated her own rapist by putting a tent stake and pounding it through his head with a mallet, and think through the length of time that takes. Those are all biblical women too. Those are all the good guys in those stories too. That's just as much biblical womanhood as going ahead and staying home, raising kids, doing that sort of stuff. That's just as much biblical womanhood. And you can do this for any historically oppressed minority, because there's all sorts of racism and homophobia and all sorts of stuff that got shoved into that third use of law and then pounded on people for generations. The baby boomers stood up against it, and to their credit, they've mostly within at least the mainline Protestant world won those battles. And they were hard-fought battles where people truly suffered trying to push out patriarchy, trying to push out racism, trying to push out all these isms that had existed in that third use of law. But our theologians have sort of thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Because instead of just attacking those, they attacked the entire concept of the third use of law, because for them, in their reality, nothing good came from it. For all of you who know Descendants 4, Rise of Red, any Descendants 4, Rise of Red people? Raise your hands. Anyone? You know? Yes? All right. Got a handful out there. All right, Descendants 4, Rise of Red. Do you all know the Queen of Hearts? Okay? She used to be this really nice, really outgoing person who really believed that if you just loved everyone, they'd be nice to you, right? Like when she's back at college. And then people are horrible and awful and bully her. And so by the time you enter the movie, she is this awful, mean person who's afraid to feel and therefore persecutes everyone around her, right? Is that fair? Fair? All right. She swung too far one way. our theologians, I think for very much the same reasons, have done the same. By the time my generation goes to seminary, we are banned or we lose points if we in any way urge anyone to do anything. No matter what the thing is we urge people to do. Like even like go pray about this. You lose points on your sermons. That's why I did a pass-fail. Because I knew it was going to be ugly because I wasn't going to put up with that. That's too far. Their argument would be, well, it's not in there. And I'd be like, it is in there. You just don't like it. There's a difference. And well, if you go and you talk about it, then people are going to think that they can be justified by their works. I'm going to tell you right now, you're not justified by your works. None of you are going to heaven because you did the right thing today. Okay? It's not how it works. It's God's love. But here's the thing. God may not care about your good works insofar as salvation. Your neighbor very well needs your good works. Your community does too. You're not going to save your soul by your good works, but you may save your neighbor's life. And that matters. I think we've had really good preaching on this long before I got here. I think part of our DNA is that we get that distinction. You guys don't go out there and do good in the world because you think like, ha ha, I have leveled up to level 41 of a Christian, 3 more levels and I'm guaranteed into Jesus land. That is not what's going on out there. What you realize is exactly what James is talking about today when he says faith without works is dead. He's not saying that, saying, well, if you don't do works, you don't get into heaven. No, he's saying if you think you have faith, but your faith that occurs on Sunday does nothing the rest of the week, you got to step back and say, do I really have one? Because if your faith is not changing anything about you, is it alive? If your tree goes into hibernation and never comes out, it's probably dead, right? Maybe not. Maybe there's other explanations. But we get that as a community. We get that as a church. We get that as part of our DNA. Today is not about securing our salvation. It's about helping our neighbor and loving our neighbor as much as we love ourselves. So as you go out today, take a few minutes. I want to thank you if you are going out and doing any of our God's work, our hand stuff, or already have. If you haven't and you can't, don't worry. There are a lot of communities out there who need a lot of help. Take some time this week and find a way to go help. Find a way to roll up your sleeves and be God's hands in this world. And it's not just for the sake of your neighbor, though your neighbor may only encounter Christ in you that week. But the opposite of that is true. I find that the easiest way to encounter Christ in a given week is by loving your neighbor. Well, they might see the Christ in you. You might see the Christ in them. Amen.